Hugh, here's what I wrestle with. If God is supposed to be the absolute sovereign creator of everything from nothing, what do we do with so-called abstract objects, numbers, logic, possibilities, propositions about the future? This blizzard of all different kinds of things that seem in any situation necessary. How can you get rid of the fact that 2 + 2 = 4, even if there were no two things around? So you believe in a God that is absolutely sovereign. What do you do with all these abstract objects?
The way I understand God's relationship to abstract objects is this, that he creates the abstract objects by creating concrete things. So that what comes first in the order of creation is always the concrete. It's always the real. It's always the individual thing. There are no prior individuals. There are no plans for individuals. Nothing like that. Always the individual concrete thing comes first. And then you can talk about possibilities. And we humans seem to have a real need to talk about possibilities. I don't think that God has much need to talk about them at all. If he's completely in control of everything, he doesn't have to worry about what's possible.
But isn't it eternally true that even if there are no concrete objects of any kind, God hasn't created anything?
Right.
Maybe there's no God. Maybe there's nothing. But in that nothing, isn't there the truth that if there were two sets of 2 cows, there would be 4 cows? Wouldn't that statement be a true statement even if nothing existed?
Well, no, because until you get cows, there's no nature of cows to talk about. But in the same way, until you get concrete pairs of things, there's no two-ness to talk about.
But that statement of a possibility, wouldn't that be true? That wouldn't be true.
No, because the possibility...
It wouldn't be false.
No, it's not false either. There's simply nothing to be said, right? So you can't say triangles could have had 4 sides. You can't say they had to have 3 sides because there's no triangularity to be spoken of. And if there isn't, then there are no possibilities about it.
So how do you imagine God in the creation process? We have a world that has lots of concrete things and particles and forces and laws, how they come together on different levels. I mean, reality is complicated.
Right.
And so how did these come about if God didn't work with certain principles? That they just make specifics out of nothing without principles? I mean, that's not the way we think. We think if we're making a house, we have to have strength of materials, we have to have forces and levers so that ceilings don't collapse. I mean, there's certain principles you have to use. We just don't make it up out of the air.
Well, but if you're an all-powerful God or an all-knowing God, a perfect God,
sounds like a magician.
Then you don't have to do it in pieces. Well, in a sense, it would be something like that, but even the magician has to have the prior plan. God doesn't have a plan.
So God is even more magic than a magician.
Well, he's an artisan. He's not a magician.
Well, an artisan has to have some specifics that you work with. I mean, you have to have some principles that you
a human artisan does, or often does, but it was change it to a human artist.
Okay.
The artist of an improvisational artist does not have.
But you're using
a plan in advance.
Right, but you're using colors, you're using form, you're basing it on certain kinds of basic principles, not making it up out of...
Well, right. It doesn't drop down out of the sky, is what you're saying. And yes, that was part of the traditional picture of God as creator, was the view was, and this is Aquinas' view in the Summa Contra Gentiles, for example, that God, in contemplating his own nature, understands all the ways that nature can be, as he would say, participated in, all the ways in which creatures could reflect that nature.
Okay.
And in the very act of comprehending all those ways that it could be reflected, God is in fact creating the world.
Okay, well, now that's different. That's a progress. That says that there's something fundamental about God that acts in some way as a general principle that God reflects on and uses that as a vehicle to create everything else. Is that the process?
Something like that would be right. It's just that God doesn't first reflect on it and then create it. The reflection itself is the creation.
And that's because God is not in time, so it's hard to talk before and after. I mean,
yes, it's partly that.
I understand that. I understand that restriction, but still there's something, at least explanatorily, that comes first.
There might be in our way of thinking about it, but it needs to be understood that in God, everything has to come at once.
Did it surprise God when it came out at once?
No, God doesn't get surprised. He just does what he does.
Some women in rural communities, are out in the field and suddenly a baby pops out because they didn't realize they were pregnant. Is that
nothing like that at all?
Bad analogy.
Right, bad analogy.
But that's what I'm driven to, because God's not planning it. God's not. He doesn't.
Right.
It just sort of happens.
Well, but it happens
without these general principles, which are abstract objects.
Well, right, but it is nevertheless intellective, because God does see what it is that he's willing the existence of. So those come together. It's not as if he first creates the world and then figures out what it was, right? To create the world is to see what it is.
Okay, but if the core characteristic of God, those are more fundamental, shall we say, than what God created. Can we say that?
Which characteristics were you thinking of?
Oh, whichever. You're closer than I am. You tell me.
All right. God's nature.
God's nature.
All right. Is counts as a basis for creation.
Yes.
In the sense that it is by contemplating his nature that
Yes.
God sees the ways in which creatures could be,
right.
And in seeing the ways in which creatures can be, that's enough for him to will the ways.
Right. So doesn't that mean that God's own characteristics are like abstract objects or general principles that form the foundations of reality, because God uses those or reflects on those in order for creation to pop out?
Something like that, but with this proviso that in God, those characteristics are, as it were, combined into one thing that we call being as such in classical theology. The characteristics themselves that typify the things that God creates, those represent, in the classical way of viewing things, a sort of unfolding of that nature that it is coalesced in God into a simple unity, a simple whole.